Okay. Are we good, Ralph? We've not gotten that in there yet. Okay, that's okay. That's okay. So we're working on that. Ralph is working on getting some slides into the chat so that the people on Zoom, you guys can click a link and get to the slides here. Um, the reason why we don't have it prepared earlier is that this morning Rabbi Rich wasn't feeling well, and so called me. He was planning to give the message today, so I kind of went in my archives and I was like, "Hey, I have a message just on this parsha that I gave a few years ago on Bereishit and how it interacts with science, and it's something I'd love to talk about. So I thought that'd be great to do. But you kind of need the slides for this one. We don't have the slides outside, so we got it printed, and so hopefully this will work for us here. And then if we can get that link in there at some point, that would be great. And you guys can just click on those slides and follow that along the way. Once we get back indoors, we'll have our regular slide screen show and everything like that. So anyhow, I know that we had to call off our own Simchat Torah services last week because our whole leadership team had a cold and was just not feeling well. And rather than redo everything, we decided to join Simchat Yisrael, and that was really exciting. Our family is recovering. Some of the littles are still up and down, but we've taken multiple COVID tests, and it's not COVID. So we're just, getting over this cold. That's what we're doing. And for those of you who were able to join Simchat's service, were any of you guys able to join? A few of you? Yeah. It was really fun, wasn't it, to watch? I mean, it's not like dance. This is one of my favorite services. We get to dance with the Torah, and it wasn't like that. But it was still fun. We got to see what they were doing and got to see them roll the scroll from Devarim down back to Bereishit. And in the beginning, which is what we read this morning, Bereishit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the whole Torah really rests on this verse, in the beginning. God is the one who created our galaxies, stars, our planets, all of the intricacies of life. And, if like the secular scientific world is right, that all these things are just random, chaotic reactions and mutations that just happen, the whole Torah kind of becomes nothing more than ancient stories, doesn't it? But if God really did create the heavens and the earth, then the Torah is a book of life. And so one big question that arises for people, especially young people as they go off into college and different things in the Torah, is that how does this work? Does the Bible contradict science? How do these things come together? So today I want to go back to the beginning, and we'll look at Bereishit and walk through the Genesis story and see how it kind of holds up against current scientific theory for the beginning of the universe, the planets, and life on Earth, and see if these things can come together. Now, of course, I'm not a scientist. My master's degree is in Jewish studies, and so what I'm doing more is just sharing with you what other people have shared with me. And I just want to give credit to Dr. Bob Newman. A few years ago, I sat and did a long interview with him on this topic, and it was really interesting. And so some of the material here comes from his work, and others as well. Now, we like to have things in really nice categories. So there's a couple different ways that people interpret the story. There's young earth people. Young earth people feel that they must read Genesis in a literal way, and I'll say literal as they understand literal to be, where you have 24 hours, as we understand 24 hours to be, days of creation, and then therefore the earth is some 6,000 years old by Jewish tradition, 5782. In the beginning, God created at this point. On the other hand, scientists who are not in the young earth camp feel that they have to reject the biblical story as mythological or as a fairy tale in favor of the current scientific consensus that the universe is some 13.7 billion years old, and the Earth is some 4.5 billion years old. So big difference, right? Now, in more fundamental Jewish groups, and it's not just Christians, fundamental Jewish groups and in Christian groups, it seems as though you either have to choose faith or choose science, and you have to choose one or the other, and you have to just go in full steam. Either you believe in the Bible and reject the scientific consensus, or you throw your Bible under the bus. And to be fair, it isn't quite so simple. It's a little bit more complex. There's a body of young earth creationist Christian apologists who present sometimes compelling alternative scientific models that reject modern radioactive and astronomical dating formulas, carbon dating, things like that, and reject how they work and suggest that that's not accurate and have some alternative and themes and whatnot. And then on the other side, some Jews and Christians will read Genesis 1 in a purely figurative way, like a myth that wasn't intended to be historical or true or literal in a sense, but to pass on important lessons about God, and something not to be taken seriously as history, but something that we can draw lessons from. Now, the problem with rejecting faith for scientific worldview is that science by its nature is always changing. Science by its nature is always changing. The purpose of science is to posit hypotheses that we then attempt to challenge and replicate and then test. But those hypotheses, according to the scientific method, always have to be falsifiable. It's very important. Science isn't something that believes things. Science is something that has to be tested and can always be changed. A new discovery is always changing the whole equation. That's the point. In our example here, it's possible that our modern radioactive and astronomical dating formulas could simply be wrong. They could simply be wrong, in which case the whole thing is a lot changes if that's the case. It may not be likely, but it's possible. So if a person ditches his faith because he took a scientific hypothesis as a proven fact, that's problematic, because science by its nature needs to be moving and changing. It's a discovery tool. It's not faith. But it's also just as problematic, I think, to reject science from your faith, because God gave us nature as a way of revealing himself to us. The pioneers of the scientific method were all very strong believers in God and saw their scientific method as a way to discover the workings of God's creation. And while some people can feel that they sort of write the creation story off as ancient fiction, or hold on to faith in God but see it as like a purely for lessons, I find that lacks substance too. It's hard to pass on to the next generation. But only with that, it leaves us with a Bible that dichotomizes between spiritual categories and then the physical world around us. And I think that's something very foreign to Judaism. I want to suggest to us a middle ground approach. And I'm not suggesting what's true about Genesis 1 here, but again, here's an idea for us to think about. C.S. Lewis calls this story a true myth. What does he mean? A myth doesn't mean it's not true. A myth is simply a kind of traditional story that's passed down from generation to generation. It may be a true myth or it may be a false myth. C.S. Lewis suggests that the creation narrative in the Bible is like the true myth that all other myths are based off of. It's a myth that was crafted and passed down from generation to generation with lots of lessons to be learned, and it also happened. So again, he's taking the deeper definition of myth, which is not, as we tend to say, like, oh, myth, it just didn't happen. A myth is a kind of literature, a kind of story that's passed down and crafted in a certain way. And so the idea is that this is a true myth, a true story. What that means is that it's not intended to be a scientific handbook for the creation of the universe. And when we step back and read Genesis 1 in that way, when we see it in this way, it comes alive. And so rather than contradict our current scientific theories of the evolution of the creation of the universe, it seems to confirm them. And this is really cool. So again, I'm not dismissing young earth creationism. I'm not dismissing other views here. What I want to do is just present an idea to consider that I think is really exciting as we read this passage. Two things that we need to consider here. If you have your slide here, you can look at the top left side here. The way these slides on this picture work is the one is bottom left, then it goes up and then down and across. It's just the way that it's printed. Do our Zoom people have the link by any chance? Not yet. Okay. It's a picture of a beautiful sunrise. So the first thing is that the story is phenomenological. That's a hard word. Phenomenological. Okay? That means that it's written from the perspective of how we would see it, as if you were watching a movie. and watching this thing unfold before you. For example, when we say a sunrise, like in the picture, we know that the sun isn't actually rising. That's clear. The earth is actually rotating, but it appears that the sun is rising. And so, based on what we would see, if we were watching, standing here in the earth, what we see is that the sun rises. That's what that word means, phenomenological. Perhaps whomever first told the Genesis story, perhaps maybe it was Moses, or as our tradition assumes, or it was passed down from generations even to him. But the story reads as though it were being told by someone who had actually been given, say, a vision of the creation of the universe, the creation of the world, like a camera viewing back into time and what it looked like, and then he writes down what he sees. So if you want to see this from the perspective of like watching a movie of the creation of the world, if you will, in a vision. Okay, the term yom in Hebrew, the term day in Hebrew, translated day, has a range of meanings. It isn't true that it only means a 24-hour period. The Bible uses it more figuratively to refer to a period in history. An example, Joel 2:31, the sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming and great dreadful day of the Lord. This is a move into a new day, a new age, a new season. So not necessarily specifically 24 hours. This is an amazing passage in 2 Peter 3:8. A day is like 1,000 years to the Lord, and 1,000 years is like a day. So if you're going to take it very literally, take this verse too. A day is like 1,000 years. One suggestion has been that these are like theological days. They are days are to humans as days are to God in Peter, like God days. So the other thing is that a 24-hour day, according to the story, didn't really exist in the beginning because we had no rotating earth around the sun. We didn't have 24 hours in the beginning. And so we're kind of reading this back into the passage. So I think it's possible, I'm not saying this is the way it is, but I think it's possible that it could be hundreds of millions of years or even billions of years as we experience a particular day. Let's posit that and see. And that could be a literal interpretation of the text. Now, let's walk through the creation story and see what we find. So if we go to the bottom right slide, number 3, we see in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That's up at the top 4 with this massive amount of light. Now, the Torah suggests that there was a beginning to creation, a time when the cosmos was not here and then when it was. The current consensus in the scientific community has the same thing. It has a beginning. We have Big Bang theory, for example. From nothing, we have a massive explosion of matter that eventually forms stars, which collect to planets, which attract moons. Now, Big Bang theory is not actually an explosion, but it would look that way from a video camera. Material suddenly appears from something tiny in a high density, high temperature state, expands from there, and space and time expands with it like this. So it would look like an explosion. We imagine tiny particles of light and other materials the size of quarks under so much pressure that they blast out from a pinhead or even smaller. And in a fraction or fractions of seconds, it would look like a huge flash of light. That's the current theory of the Big Bang. So both biblical and scientific models are looking at the universe from the same perspective. There was nothing, and then whoosh, here was something. So that's, I find, really interesting. Okay, let's keep going. We have the next verse, and here we have to turn our page. It's on the back. So we go from here. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then over here, where we have this cool picture. Darkness was on the surface of the deep. Now, of course, these are not actually pictures of the creation of the world. These are just space pictures that look like it, in my mind. So we have Genesis 1:2. Now the earth was formless and void, or in chaos. Now remember that you're looking at what you could see if you were there. After Big Bang theory, this is in the scientific world, raw gases and material are constantly expanding outward. We might think of this time as a period where God is preparing materials that will eventually form our sun and our earth. God uses early stars to make heavier elements. When those stars blow up, they scatter material into other areas. The raw materials then pulled together into huge gas clouds to form new stars. And eventually the material that would make up our solar system would have been gathered into a gigantic, formless, and chaotic gas cloud, hydrogen, helium, heavier dust particles. And so what you would see if you were seeing this was darkness was on the surface of the earth was formless and void. So the interpretation here is that he's not speaking about the earth necessarily, he's speaking about what will become the earth and seeing this huge voidness of gas and things moving around. And it fits this verse very well. Okay, so we have a beginning. We move into a swirling image of the elements of the earth without any form. And then we move to, at the top, darkness was on the surface of the deep. Top left. Now, this is really interesting. Dr. Newman thinks that Genesis shifts angles here from looking at the gas cloud from afar to looking within the gas cloud, as if it were a vision. Here, the gas cloud contracts and under its own gravity becomes so thick and so dense that you wouldn't be able to see through it at all. It appears that darkness was over the surface of the deep cloud. So you're all of a sudden, what you see is this amorphous gas cloud. You move inside of it and everything is condensing around it and it becomes this dark cloud and all you see is darkness. And that's how he describes this poetically. And then over to slide number 7 on the bottom right. And then we read that God's Spirit hovers over the surface of the waters. The Ruach Elohim was hovering over the surface of the water. Now, of course, we don't have a formed earth with water yet in the Genesis story. Yet the Hebrew for waters, mayim, can mean sea. It doesn't mean a literal sea, but a phenomenological sea. So this is describing what might appear like a vaporous sea swirling on the surface of this dark, dense gas cloud. Okay, then in Genesis 1:3, God says, slide 8, let there be light. Let there be light. And so in our narrative, we wouldn't see this as the beginning, the creation of light itself. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to see anything. But this isn't what happened at the Big Bang. This is as the materials collapse, the particles collide together, they create so much heat that the cloud begins to glow. Into an observer from inside the glass cloud, it's now light everywhere. All you see is light. And this light is here. And then we go to slide 9. If we go to the, let's see, there's slide 9. Here, on the next page over, where it says God separates light from darkness, right there. And so the inside of this gas cloud is glowing, if you can imagine this. But as the material contracts more into a ball and the inner part spins faster and faster and faster, what happens is it creates these magnetic fields. And this is actually how the scientific model of the universe creation happens, is that it creates these inner fields and a magnetic field. And what happens is the dark raw matter that's not burning goes out like this. And it leaves an inside that is hot and glowing in the middle. The magnetic fields cause this material to move faster than it normally would. Its centrifugal force pulls the dark material away. So if you're looking at it from afar, you'd see all light, and then you'd see light and darkness begins to separate out from the light as the universe is this raw material is just spreading out into the universe. Okay, slide 10. So what happens is these virtually dark particles, they come together, they stick together, and that forms planets. And this is how the scientific understanding of how planets is developed. This is what it is. And so what we know as the Earth finds its resting place in an orbit around this star, in an orbit around the sun. Now our Torah jumps to a new scene. Now that the Earth is here, it jumps to the Earth's surface, rotating around the sun, spinning on its axis. As part of the time we see the glowing sun, and then part of the time we see the darkness beyond the sun, day and night. And that's where we have slide 11. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So what actually happens here is that planetary rotation gives the night and the day, and all of a sudden you have night and day as soon as the Earth is formed. So it fits with the whole story of Genesis so far. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was evening and the morning, the first day. We've concluded this huge first day of the act of the creation of the Earth and the creation of the cosmos. Okay, let's go to slide 12, which is up at the top of the page there. We move into our second phase of creation. Let there be an expanse in the midst of the water, let it be for separating water from water, it says. So God made the expanse and separated the water that was below the expanse from the water that was above it, we read. And God called the expanse sky, and there was evening and there was morning, a second day. Now, in the beginning, the Earth, back to our scientific model, is very hot and asteroids are crashing into the Earth, but eventually that cools off. And as the Earth is separated into a center that's burning hot and a cooler outside section, what happens is water molecules which are bound to the particles of dust, they begin to release and are driven to the surface of the Earth. And there's actually a verse in chapter 2 that we read in Genesis that talks about it wasn't raining. Water didn't come from rain. It came from the steam coming out of the earth. And that's what this would be, steam coming out of the earth, vapor coming out into the atmosphere as the earth gradually cools. So these water molecules are at high temperatures of vapor. They gradually cool. They turn to liquid water and flood the surface of the earth. And this creates dense cloud coverage over the whole earth. Water's above, and liquid waters below, an expanse between. So we have sky and we have an earth that's filled with water. This is the scientific model of the world. And it's told through a story in Genesis. It's really cool. Okay, let's go to slide 13. Next page here. Then God said, "Let the waters below the sky be gathered to one place. Let dry ground appear." And God called the dry ground land, and the collection of water he called seas. And God saw that it was good. So Earth's upper surface, back to the science model, crust is made up of these large tectonic plates which are moved around. The motion of these plates push the land up, and it creates continents and huge basins which the water then gathers. We call these basins oceans. We call these oceans. So from the perspective of one watching the earth, you'd begin to see land. Let the waters be gathered into one place, and let dry land appear. This is the scientific model of the development of the earth. It's very cool. Okay, 14, up at the top left. God said, "Let the land sprout green grass, plants yielding seed, each according to its species, and trees making fruit with seed in it, each according to its species." And God saw that it was good. So there was evening and there was morning, the completion of the third day. So early plant life, which was developing deep in the waters, now begins to appear on land. And of course, this is the evolutionary model of how life begins to be created in the world, right here in the scripture. Slide 15 down in the bottom right. Now, this is a really interesting one. God said, "Let the lights in the expanse of the sky be for separating the day and from the night. They will be signs, and for seasons, and for days and years. They will be for lights in the expanse of the sky to shine upon the land." God saw that it was good. So there was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. So this whole day, this fourth day, is really interesting because it seems like it's out of order. I thought that the sun and moon would have already been in place by now. If you have trees and you have green growing on the earth, how could that be? How else did plant life get there? But we need to take a step back here. Again, think about this from this phenomenological perspective. What's going on here is that prior to plant life emerging, the cloud coverage in the atmosphere would have been so dense that light from the sun would only appear as a vague glow over a dark cloud. And one could tell day and night, but you couldn't tell what was causing it. But as plant life appears in our evolutionary model, the atmosphere becomes filled with oxygen. And what happens is oxygen clears the sky. And so for the first time on day 4, you see the sun and you see the moon. And God has positioned these in sky that we could now see that would then govern the seasons. It's really neat. Okay, let's go to slide 17. This also provides oxygen for animals. Before it was all CO2, or mostly. Now it's more oxygen develops. And so in Genesis 1:20, God says, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures. Let flying creatures fly across the expanse of the sky." And this is what exactly we see happening in the fossil record. We have first animal life appear in the oceans. We see the Cambrian explosion with 541 million years ago, according to this dating system, where a massive amount of primitive life seems to just appear out of nowhere and contain all the building blocks for animal life on Earth to come. God saw that it was good, the scripture says. There was evening and there was morning, the fifth phase of creation. Move to slide 18. I think that's a really cool picture here. Then God said, let the land bring forth living creatures according to their species, livestock, crawling creatures according to their species. And then in verse 19, slide 19, we see an age of developing land animals, from the first vertebrates to dinosaurs to mammals to primates. And God saw that it was good. And then on the top right, slide 20, we have in verse 26, let us make man in our image after our likeness. And of course, we see in nature that humans are last in the fossil chain. So this is, again, follows the same scientific models that we're seeing as we evaluate our world and look around our world. Humans are unique in creation. They're made in God's image. They're given conscious thought. They're given the ability to choose right from wrong. We have a mind in a different way. And archaeological evidence even suggests that there was a more sudden change that led to creative human artifacts. They just appear all of a sudden on the scene of the world. Because of time, we'll save Adam and Eve and the garden and how that comes to pass for another time. There's some really neat ideas about that. But that'll be another part if we do that. So to close, the details of Genesis 1 match what is our best scientific model for the early earth and the development of life. And that scientific model might change. We might understand these things in different ways as we continue to grow. But from my perspective, it's really cool because it would be impossible for an ancient writer, think about this, an ancient writer who knew none of this stuff, to craft a human legend that would actually follow to the T everything we've discovered from nature in our age of scientific discovery. It's remarkable. They would have no reference point for any of these things. And if you look, we did this at camp one year when we covered this material. We actually read dozens of other creation stories from around the world, and they are nothing like this. And it's humorous to read a lot of them, but they're nothing like this. They'd have no reference point. They would have never heard of any of these concepts. They wouldn't have got the flow of the development of life correct. And if that's true, that makes a strong case that the rest of it is true as well. And so to me, that means that we have even greater confidence in the Torah and greater confidence in the things that we read of spiritual value that comes from the Torah. And we read in our Besorah passage today, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word of God who created the world became flesh and dwelt among us. And Yeshua says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the way to the creator of the universe, the one through whom all of this creation came to be. And he says, I will never leave you as orphans. And he says, I will never forsake you. So I'll leave you with that. Be encouraged that these things really can come together. There's more to learn. There's more to grow. We don't understand everything. There's an element of mystery, but they come together, and it's good, and God is good. So Shabbat Shalom, everybody.